Ann Bauer. I'm a professor of biology at SpectorCast series on research. I am hosting and going to be interviewing Dr. Diana Condell. Dr. Condell and I work on herbal medicine, and we have for many, many years. So it's a great privilege to interview her today. Dr. Condell, as a scientist, can you tell us a little bit about your background and why did you?
Okay, so my background is very complex. I started off doing a lot of work in terms of what's referred to as pathophysiology. So this was basic molecular mechanisms, how microbes cause disease, the different disease processes, etc. And I worked a lot with microorganisms and with the immune system for many, many years. And then I became sort of, I guess, somewhat diverted into looking at herbal medicines because I was working with a couple of people from different colleges, namely Dr. Brian George and Dr. Alex Messenger, and we were developing what we called breathing wall systems. So I got recruited in as the air quotes microbiologist to come and work with them. And as a result, we started looking for natural products that could be used as antimicrobials. And so the thing that was interesting to me is that for thousands of years, people have used herbal medicines and spices, usually just kind of like stuff you found in your back garden that people tried. They ground it up into a paste, made a tea out of it, they did something with it. And as a result, they found they got better from things. And maybe, they got an infection of some kind, maybe a gastrointestinal infection, maybe it was worms, maybe it was all kinds of different things. But these herbal medicines seem to work. From that grew, just by chance, the thousands and thousands of years of Ayurvedic medicine and also traditional Chinese medicines that use blends of these compounds that are usually individualized per person. So looking at that and comparing that with conventional medicine sort of was a real disconnect, because conventional medicine says you have one thing and you take one thing and it fixes a one thing. And there isn't really a blend of things. Sometimes you have a couple of things that work synergistically together, but most of the time you're just looking at a thing that is able to do something. So you have a headache, you take an aspirin. But what's more interesting is that many of our medicines, and I know Dr. Bauer is very familiar with this because he medicinal plants, is that most of our medications that we now use came from plant products. Mm-hmm. And that again was because people had them available. If you had malaria, then you chewed a bark from a tree, which sounds weird, but that's where the malaria medicines came from. So the scientist in me said, okay, these people are using these herbal medicines, tinctures or whatever, continue to use them. So why have they continued using them? And obviously we know there's a thing called a placebo effect, which means that up to 30% of people get better because you tell them if you take the medicine that they will. There had to be more than just the placebo effect. The placebo effect wouldn't have made something keep going for thousands of years because people would have realized they would have been on to you and they would have given up the medications. So then I started looking at these things chemically and biochemically, and lo and behold, they were mainly things that were lipid molecules. They were organic molecules, which is like many of our medicines that we use today, and many of them shared similar physical features. So I had to go back and trawl back through my biochemistry, which was many more years ago than I care to recall, and say, how does this biochemical structure resemble these other biochemical structures? And as I started to look at these things, it became very apparent that many of the medications that we're using, because they had their history in plants, similarly, plant products still have a potential use today, and especially for those who are looking for a more natural way of dealing with things. And, I would sort of, my immediate thought was, the scientists said, what's going on with all of this? Clearly, what's going on? How can I understand this? And how can I bridge the gap between Ayurvedic medicine and traditional Chinese medicine, which has a lot of terminology which is from those cultures, and the ethnographic use of these types of herbs and spices, and try and make it connect with things that people will look at and go, hey, yeah, I see, that's being done in a trial. That's being used successfully. Nobody knew what they were taking, so it's a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. And from that has stemmed 15 years of research, because that's what interests me. It's like, what is going on, the curiosity value.
Awesome. So getting into the connection between traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine with clinical based evidence and clinical trials, how did you stumble upon turmeric then, in particular of the 30,000 herbs that are out there?
Honestly, I just ran a Google search and I said herbal medicines, anti-inflammatory, and herbal medicines for pain. And anti-inflammatory and pain are two really big deals right now. So we have, as a society, more and more and more people who are developing chronic inflammatory diseases. Mm-hmm. And chronic inflammatory diseases is really just a big pot that you put in many different kinds of disease. That could be autoimmune conditions, which are rife. 20 million Americans have autoimmune diseases. That could be cancers. 1 in 3 people get cancer in their lifetime of various kinds. And that's because our immune system doesn't keep up, or it doesn't recognize this foreign entity as being something it has to get rid of. You have millions of people who develop osteoarthritis. So osteoarthritis is kind of, if you don't want osteoarthritis, the only recommendation that we have at this point is don't get old. Because the minute you get old, stuff goes wrong. It's like it being an old car. Your hoses wear out, so your cardiovascular system's a problem. Your bones and joints wear out, so they're a problem. And conventional medicine doesn't have any answers for these things. It doesn't have any answers for how do I intervene to remove the inflammation, which is causing discomfort. It's causing reduction of ability to have a normal life, to have a life which people need. So for a lot of people, they've said, okay, I'm going to keep going back to my primary care, my specialist. What can you do for me? What can you do for me? And the problem is that the answer is not very much. So realistically, what they've been able to develop is they have a series of anti-inflammatory drugs, and they go on a hierarchy. So you start with what are called non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And I think everyone on this call is probably familiar with these. These are the things that if you go into ShopRite and you got a headache, you grab one off the shelf and you take 2 and it goes. The problem with those is, and they include things like Tylenol, they include things like Motrin, aspirin itself. They all work the same way. And the way that they work is they just shut off your inflammatory cascade. Sounds good and might work for a short term. But the problem is that these medications are not, they were never designed for the usage that they're being put to. So what happens is people are in pain, so they take medicine. And when they take the medicine, then it blunts the pain and it allows them to do important things like sleep, move around, and have a functional life. The problem is that though that time frame is being extended further and further, and we actually only were ever designed to use those for 3 to 6 months. That's what the clinical trials were for. After that, you're supposed to go into the next step up, which is some kind of a disease-modifying drug, which are more aggressive, more side effects. They shut off the immune system completely in many cases. People have terrible side effects from them. And once you start on this sort of slippery slope of taking stuff, what also happens is there is evidence that, for example, in osteoarthritis, the patients who take these actually have to have joint replacements somewhere between 10 and 15 years earlier than if you took nothing at all. So you're trapped. It's a rock and a hard place. Devil in the deep blue sea, as they'd say. So what do? You're in pain. You can't sleep. You can't function. You can't work. All you can think about is aching, pain, inflammation. So you take these medicines because it's literally becomes the drug of choice for people. So what patients are beginning to say is, okay, I don't want to be on this cascade of medicines that's going to wind up giving me something like a gastric bleed or erosions in my intestine or killing me, which they ultimately can. People do die of these gastric bleeds as well. 40% of people who take them long term wind up with gastric problems of some kind or small intestinal erosions. Patients are beginning to get savvy. The one thing I will say is that we kind of lag behind. In the United States, we're way behind anybody else. So when you look at places like Europe, Australia, and certainly many countries which we would refer to as developing nations, they've got a really big track history of using these things. And in Europe, they are actually part of the curriculum in medical school. They are part of the things that people use routinely. And as a result, they're basically being standardized, used, and distributed just like you would a classic pharmaceutical. In the United States, it's become more of an under the table type of idea where people are told, well, try something, see if it works for you, make sure it doesn't, it's not contraindicated because of what else you're taking. And as a result, it's a growing thing. So in the US, we're looking at, depending on what herbal medicine you're thinking of, you're looking at somewhere between 40 and 60% of people with these chronic syndromes trying them, just because they are out there. And that becomes sort of a piece. And you're looking at this in terms of a developing market. So this is really very much something that we need to look at, that we need to explore. And I think anyone who's in healthcare needs some training on, because your patients are taking these things. You do need to know how they work, and they do have scientific and medical benefits if used correctly and if acquired correctly.
So can you tell us a little bit more about what the medical evidence is? Because there's so much misinformation out there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So there's two issues with getting the medical information. The first thing is that you need to actually produce a stable version of these entities. And most of them, because they are organic molecules, are fairly unstable. So producing a stable form has been difficult, but once that stable form has been produced, they need to go through what's called a double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial. And these are the gold standard for trials. So the idea here is that you have two patients set. The patients don't know what they're getting. The person who's giving the medicine doesn't know what they're getting either. And you have to have a placebo in there. So the placebo is in there. Some of them actually have really interesting varieties. So you add in not just a placebo, but you add the regular medicine that they would take. So you might have 3 patient groups, and now you're trying to compare it with, does it work just because the patient wants it to? Is it better than placebo? Or B, does it work just as well or better than the regular medicine? And that's been sort of and looking through the literature, there are now, because people have been doing studies like this for over 20 years, certainly on the biggies, if you like. So turmeric's one of the big ones because of the additive inside it, which is a thing called curcumin. And people are looking at curcumin and they realize they can do interesting things with it. They can increase its bioavailability by adding a thing called piperine, which is from black pepper. And so as they sort of begin to look at these, we do have a number of clinical trials out there. They're not huge. There isn't millions of them like there might be, for example, for acetaminophen, but they are out there and they do work. And I'm going to give you a really classic example of one, which is actually the reason that this person started taking turmeric as well, which is there was a great study. It was done about 5 years ago. And there was this group and they developed a medication and they called it Mariva. I don't know why they called it that, but they call them all kinds of weird names and that's what you got. They were able to take curcumin and stabilize it into a gel cap with oil and with added piperine to produce bioavailability. So they took these patients, they did an amazing double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial of it. And they had these patients at the beginning, and they, instead of using mild people, they actually took people who were really severely osteoarthritic. So this was a person who couldn't even walk on a treadmill for like 5 minutes at the beginning of the trial without screaming. So by the end of 6 months, which was a really good time frame for it to get into their system, start to work on the joints, etc., these people were not only walking for 5 minutes, they were walking over 5 miles on uphill treadmills. And everybody in the study said, what is this thing? Who was on the active drug? They said, I don't know what you gave me, but I want it. How do I get it and where is it? Unfortunately, with that group, because they were a small company, they didn't have the finances to get everything licensed through the FDA. And the FDA is like your next level up. So the problem is, unless these types of medications are picked up by pharmaceutical companies with a big budget, because it costs you nearly $1 billion to actually get these things out into market, you're not going to get anywhere. And so for a lot of these small groups, they produced great results, but they couldn't do anything. But fortunately, this is actually being sold on Amazon. I knew the product, and I've been using it for 10 years now. There are studies out there. Some of them are not valid because they're not double-blinded, but there are some excellent double-blinded studies. And really, of all the anti-inflammatories and all the pain relievers, curcumin is one of the best studied, which is kind of interesting.
Can you tell us more about the science behind how it worked? What is it actually doing that it had that effect on people with severe osteoarthritis?
So what it does is, to compare it with the classic pain medicines that everybody on this call probably recognizes, and without like going into being too sciencey, because otherwise everyone is going to be like, what is going on? So the way that the classic anti-inflammatory works is we have a biochemical cascade in our cells, and that cascade to induce pain and inflammation starts with a substance called NF-kappa beta. And NF-kappa beta is kind of like the hub at the wheel of every cell. And it is kind of, the way that it works is it's almost like a sensor. So it senses the environment that it's in by getting information from the outside of the cell. And when inflammation happens, it gets switched on, and it's switched on temporarily. And as a result, it upregulates a lot of genes, and those genes produce products that make inflammation happen. So the way that the anti-inflammatories that we have currently work is, all they do is they just switch this thing off completely. And the problem with doing that is if you get an infection, if you get a wound, then you can't heal properly. Also, there are certain parts of the body that rely on this almost like small inflammatory reaction to be always on, and that includes your gastrointestinal tract and also your kidneys. So if you keep taking these NSAIDs, what you do is you switch all of that off. What the curcumin does is it's what's called an adaptogen, which means it does a dimmer. So just like you have a dimmer switch in your house, it dials down the inflammation. And what this allows you to do is it means that you're not in the chronic cycle of pain, inflammation, pain, inflammation, pain, inflammation, but you can still mount a reaction against classic infectious agents, etc. So curcumin seems to work directly and target those mechanisms. So it actually binds directly to this NF-kappa beta. It also binds to some of the switch-on genes that come on during inflammation, and it dials everything back so that you're just able to mount an acute inflammatory reaction, which is what you need to get rid of infections, what you need to heal a wound, etc., etc. And it's especially useful in the chronic cycle of things that happen in osteoarthritis, for example. There's some evidence that it works in rheumatoid arthritis, although that's still a little nebulous right now. It's also very good at blocking the activities of infectious agents. So another big problem that we have in the world today is multi-resistant bacteria. Multi-resistant bacteria, the thing that we created as human beings because we wanted to have a way of fighting off infections. They got overused, overprescribed for things they weren't needed for, like virus infections. And as a result, we wound up with these multi-resistant staphylococci. MRSA, I think, is something that everybody on this course is familiar with because it's all over everything. C. difficile, which is a really big problem in hospitals. There's also another one called Pseudomonas that some of you might be familiar with. So all of these we have a really hard time with. And now with this thing that we call climate change, which we're seeing the emergence of new types of infections. We're all sitting on the Zoom meeting right now because we're all trapped because of COVID. So these new and more aggressive infections are coming in. What's really interesting is curcumin has been shown, at least in vitro, i.e. in cells in the lab, to be able to kill HIV, the Zika virus, multi-resistant staphylococci, etc. And that's recent. These are very recent studies. These are not even the last decade. Some of these are in the last 5 years. I looked this morning, 2 of these came up in the last year. So these are very recent. And then these things have to go through a series of steps. So does it work in the lab? Yes, no. Then does it work in animal models? Animal models, there's a boatload of data that says, yes, it works and it is effective and it can protect you against infections and it can dial down osteoarthritis. So those are things that we know it works really well with. We know it works really well killing tumor cells, for example. And there is actually a clinical trial going on right now in China where they're using curcumin as an additional piece as well as chemotherapeutics to see if it will boost the effects of those drugs. So there is evidence out there. It's just the problem is trying to look for all of it. And as you try and look for all of it, you can't search for it using classical terms. What you have to do is you have to go literally onto Google and you have to just type in what you want and then scroll through all the stuff until you find what you need. So that becomes a problem for people because we're used to doing the classic ProQuest or Medline searches, and you won't necessarily find these trials out there through those types of agencies, but they are definitely out there.
So does it matter, given that it clearly works, does it matter if I eat it or if I take it as a supplement? And if I take it as a supplement, how do I know? So go ahead, tell us the difference between eating it and as a supplement.
All right, so some people do eat it. You can eat it, which will actually be good in two respects. One is that if you have it, or if you put it in your mouth, it may kill some of the harmful pathogens in your mouth, and those are being directly related or linked to atherosclerosis. And atherosclerosis, which is hardening of the blood vessels, is also linked to things like Alzheimer's. So it also. Okay, Manuela, you have to mute yourself. Okay.
We have to mute to start, okay, please? Sorry. Yeah. That's okay. We're just going to keep going.
Okay, so one of the things that they have suggested is eating it may or may not work. If you do eat it directly, one of the best ways to eat it is with a meal that has lipids in it because it's lipid soluble. And if you just have a low lipid diet, it's hard to absorb that way. And some people are on special diets. Plus, it doesn't necessarily taste great if you stick it in your mouth and chew on it. So that isn't necessarily the best way of doing it. The optimal way to get it really is you have to get it in a gel cap form. Solid form isn't going to work. You need a gel cap. The gel cap has to have a lipid vehicle inside it. So you have to actually look to see what all of it says. It should have something which increases bioavailability, like piperine, or the other one is I think called bromelain. These two have been clinically shown, and they're actually used for therapeutic drugs like for cancers, etc. They increase bioavailability naturally, so they act as what's called an adjuvant to get things absorbed into your blood. So that's your first piece. Your second piece is the dosage. So you want to have around 1,000 milligrams of bioavailable curcumin, and that's not always the case. So you need to make sure that is there. You also don't want too much curcumin and turmeric because it can produce side effects. So, it's not like, it's like anything, you can't just, if you have a headache and you take 2 aspirin, you don't take more than 2 aspirin, there's a limitation. So, they have shown that 8,000 milligrams is the highest that anyone's ever been able to take. And all that produced was really vomiting and diarrhea, but it can have other effects as well. You may have some drug interactions at that level. So you want to be really, really cautious about higher levels and higher pieces in terms of what you're doing. You also want to make sure where you get it from. So as Dr. Bauer mentioned initially, a lot of these types of, because they're coming typically, turmeric's not grown here. It's a semi-tropical plant. It's being made in another country. It's being processed somewhere else. And then the medications are coming to the United States. So it also, you want something which is organic, or it says NGO on it. So it wants to be definitely something which says it's being grown in a correct way. It also, you want to make sure what else is in it because people put fillers in it. Sometimes, especially if it's not grown organically, it can have pesticides on it. You don't want that. You don't want lead in it. You don't want heavy metal poisoning from it. So you have to be kind of cautious where you get it from. So advisedly, you want to be, you could ask a naturopath. You could ask people who've done their homework. We've done our homework in terms of where to get these medicines from. And, amazingly, places like the giant retailers like Amazon sell it. You don't necessarily have to go to GNC or something. You can get these and they are available out there. But again, you have to be very cautious what you use. And you should always check with your physician. If you just try, you can't just like throw things in your face. You do actually want to check and make sure, even if you don't know if it contradicts anything or counteracts anything that you're taking, or boosts things. It may increase the effects of some medicines that you're on. So check with your physician, or if they don't know, ask the pharmacist. Pharmacists are usually really good people to ask in terms of natural medicines, because they usually are very well educated, and it's one of the courses that they have to take in order to get through pharmacy school.
Awesome. So two of the side effects that I notice when I take turmeric is it's a very strong diuretic. And so you're going to notice that you're going to go to the bathroom more often. Yeah. And some people also get nausea. And so I actually take turmeric by eating it because I love traditional Indian food. And people in India actually get a dose of 750 milligrams a day. But that means you have to eat Indian food every day in order to get the right dose. But that's just another option.
Yeah.
And to round up, why don't you tell us about what you're working on now? Because I'm looking at our time here.
So basically, just a quick sort of segue. So this year, very excitingly, I published my first book. So I was very excited about that. That was a book which came out through Nova. It's even listed on Amazon. I'm an author on Amazon, very exciting. And that was on a substance called allicin. And allicin is the active principle in onions. So when you cut into an onion, or it's a similar substance in onion, but garlic has the major components of it. And so when you cut into it, that sort of sulfurous smell that you get, that is actually the substance allicin. And allicin has a lot of similarities. All these kind of organic molecules are very similar. And actually, interestingly, a lot of these things are related with each other. So allicin was a sort of interesting one because I knew about the cardiovascular effects. I had no idea about some of the other effects it has. So it's effective against tumors. It's a broad spectrum antimicrobial. It's even an insecticide. It's sort of an amazing, these are amazing natural medicines that you could get just by, reaching into your own refrigerator. And then right now I'm working on gingerols, which are the active principle for ginger. And ginger actually is a cousin of, well, the thing we've been talking about today, which is turmeric. They actually belong to the same family. They're from the Zingiber family. And again, it's semi-tropical. So I guess really what I would advocate everyone who's on this call to do is just try it. Worst case scenario, if it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for you. Check with your doctor to see if it's a feasible thing, but it's worth a shot. You really can't, the worst case scenario is it's going to give you nausea and some diarrhea, and you might go to the bathroom a bit more often. Think about that compared with the side effects of a conventional medicine. It really isn't anything when you're kind of taking it home in the end. So I want to thank everyone. I want to thank the Spector Center for inviting me today. I was very excited. I want to thank Dr. Bauer for interviewing me, and this was great. And if people have questions who are on the call, please email me. Feel free to, and I'm quite happy to share any other information that people might be interested in.
So go ahead and look for Dr. Kendall's book. She's got several books out and another one coming out on ginger in the next year. Look for those references because she pulls together hundreds and hundreds of clinical evidence all in one place. Good. Thank you so much, everybody. And I look forward, if anybody's really interested, take medicinal plants if you're a student. Bye, everybody. Be well. Bye.